40 years, it's a long time. That's like half the average lifespan of a human. So there's this new Indiana Jones film, and it's over half a lifetime since the first movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, came out. Harrison Ford is still in it, half a human lifetime later. Oh, good Lord, insert your own ageism jokes here. We know that they're going on in both of our heads after all. I mean, he was pretty old in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And that movie, which may or may not have existed, and may or may not have come out in 2008, because I'm still in denial that that movie exists, well, that was a decade and a half before this came out. And at the time of recording, the reviews for the new one, they don't look so hot. If only we could look at Indiana Jones then, the same age as he was in that perfect original 80s trilogy. Well, I can do you one better than that. How about when he was even younger than that? He'd be very spry, wouldn't he? And well, yes, that would be the young Indiana Jones, a period of his life of which two separate games exist. One is on the MegaDrive and one on the NES. Now, I want you to imagine that you're that old knight in Last Crusade.
Knew you would come.
And he's presented you with a series of Indiana Jones video games. And he's asked you to pick out the good young Indiana Jones game out of the two.
Which one is it? You must choose. But choose wisely.
And you can mull on that for a little while, because before we get a whipping and a stealing artefacts, what in the name of Short Round is this movie hero doing on my TV game series? Well, you dunderhead, it was a TV show. The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles debuted on ABC 3 years after the original trilogy's closer, The Last Crusade, and it was broadcast in 1992. It ran for 2 series, with 4 made-for-TV movies that finished up in 1996. George Lucas was more directly involved than his partner in crime Steven Spielberg this time, acting as the executive producer and writing an extensive timeline of Jones's life from 1905 onwards. The Last Crusade, of course, had a whip crack, if you will, at Indy's youth, with River Phoenix playing Henry Jr. in an opening escapade which shoehorned as many of the Indiana Jones character traits and accessories origins into about 10 minutes. Fancy all that happening in the same day, eh? Still, it gave Lucas the taste for the adventures of a young Indiana Jones, and so he pursued the idea of a TV show about the archaeologist's formative years. He approached River Phoenix and Harrison Ford about appearing, but both didn't really fancy working on the television show at that stage, although Ford did turn up in one episode as he bookended an entry called The Mystery of the Blues. Ford here was playing Indiana Jones at about 50 years old. This was a format that was extended to the whole show. However, they used an even older Indy doing the bookending and narrating task, using character actor George Hall portraying Indiana Jones as a rather broken down 90-year-old. We're getting pretty close to that with Harrison Ford now, aren't we? Oh Christ, everything makes me feel so old. The tales that the older Indiana Jones would regale would be about him at the ages of 8 to 10 and then 16 to 21. These roles were played by Corey Carrier and Sean Patrick Flannery, respectively. It took Indiana Jones through his childhood, through the First World War, and through to the Great Depression. During his adventures, Jones would come across many famous faces from those eras, like Al Capone, Teddy Roosevelt, Leo Tolstoy, Ernest Hemingway, Pablo Picasso, and a younger Winston Churchill, usually playing a part in shaping their destinies. It was good fun 90s telly hookum, but perhaps a little bit overly ambitious. It was very, very expensive to make, and viewing figures showed that the public didn't really have a taste for a Indiana Jones without the screen-filling charisma of Harrison Ford at that stage. It looked the part and was packed with an incredible who's who of guest stars, writers and directors. Joe Johnston, Frank Darabont and Carrie Fisher did behind the camera work, and in front of the camera, well, how does Christopher Lee, Max von Sydow, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Anthony Daniels, Daniel Craig, Tom Courtenay, Liz Hurley, Anne Hesh, Vanessa Redgrave, Keith David and Terry Jones sound, just for starters? It was a show beloved by critics as well, winning 6 Emmys and several other major television awards. It just didn't, for whatever reason, stick with the public. I think perhaps it would have been more popular and would have worked better had they waited another 30 years and utilised Disney+. I suspect Harrison Ford would have been more on board with it, the budget and effects would have been a bit sharper, and well, I think it probably would have been a lot more preferable than the old boy running around on our cinema screen in 2023. As it was, of the 70 stories that Lucas had planned and made outlines for, less than half were put on the small screen. A shame. So what about the games then? Well, remember I gave you that task of being the knight at the end of Last Crusade and asking you to choose between the 2 titles? Well, let's see how that would have panned out.
It's more beautiful than I'd ever imagined.
12 seconds later.
He chose poorly.
Yes, the inferior one of the two is unquestionably 1994's The Instruments of Chaos on the Sega MegaDrive or Genesis. Look, it's the flashier cup. Yeah, see? It's clever. I thought this one through. This was published by Sega of America and was programmed by the Brian A. Rice Incorporated development house in Chicago, who made the only Home Alone game of the time that wasn't absolute dogshite. Still, what an incredibly bland name for a development house. Brian A. Rice Incorporated. In the Instruments of Chaos, Jones is doing a bit of counter-spy work for France, as those dastardly Germans are travelling the globe gathering advanced weaponry technologies from various nefarious sorts in order to use against the Allies in World War I. The journey takes Indy to Tibet, India, Egypt and England before a final daring dart into the eye of the German storm itself. You are armed with a revolver, grenades and your trusty whip, which can be flipped and swung about like Castlevania 4, or alternatively your man meat when you think that nobody's looking at home. Indy bounds about in a well-animated fashion around numerous old architecture. His trip to London, for instance, takes him both a dangerously stormy jaunt on Tower Bridge and into Big Ben, for example. The sprites are crisp and the backgrounds are detailed, with some nice occasional parallax scrolling going on behind the action. It all looks very competent until you interact with it. All I can say is thank heavens for save states. This game is hard. It is very hard, but not in a good, oh let's try again kind of hard way. It's hard in a really poor game design way. That's the worst kind of hard. Controls are where the first issues set in. It controls absolutely terribly. Indy will burst into a sprint if you hold the direction button down for too long, not gradually building up momentum, just going full Billy-O like Linford Christie being chased down by an escaped hippo. This will see you careering off ledges which will require a deft touch, and this will result in Jones either carking it by falling off the bottom of the screen or you having to climb all the way back to where you were. Gah, awful. The whip too, with its flappy nature, sounds like it should be quite useful and intuitive and fun to use, much like it was in the aforementioned SNES classic Castlevania 4. In this game though, it whiffs its intended target a lot, which is a right pain in the bum when you've got spiky balls coming in to squish Indy before he sired Mutt Williams with Marion Ravenwood. In fact, the hit detection in the game all round is dreadful, with Indy missing shots that he's lined up with. And then there's a bad carryover from Castlevania as well, in the fact that when Indy gets hit, the fellow will recoil back like he's been kicked in the chest by a stallion. This, along with that overly sensitive running control, will put you in all manner of frustrating positions made doubly bad by the fact you've got to reach the end of the level in a strict time limit. If you don't, then well, the Germans are going to have some new toys to play with that will see them win World War I, and it'll all be your fault. Just be better. It's a shame that it's so full of frustrating elements, as there was a lot of work put into this, but I can only really recommend it if you want to be as irritated as you would be by being trapped in a lift with Willie Scott and Short Round from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom for an afternoon. And then Mutt Williams turns up and opens the door to rescue you, only then the door shuts behind him and you end up stuck with Shia LaBeouf as well. Mega reviewed Instruments of Chaos in June 1994, and they seemed as frustrated as I was, giving it a 50%, but summing it up with, "No point in buying a game you cannot play." That does sound pretty salty, doesn't it? Sega Pro looked at it in the same month, and they awarded a game an even lower 39%. They said, "This looks and plays like a poor man's Aladdin. The animation is awful, and the levels are just poorly designed. Far too chaotic." So then, all that glitters is not gold. What about that NES game? The Carpenter's Cup of young Indiana Jones titles.
You have chosen wisely.
Well, this one came out 2 years prior and was courtesy of Japanese giants Jaleco. Cue the logo.
Jericho.
And I'm happy to report that this is so much better. It's pretty hard still, but in a fairer way than its big brother on the Sega machine. I say big brother, but the NES one's older. So I guess the MegaDrive one is fatter and younger. Anyway, Indiana first finds himself in Mexico battling Pancho Villa and his bandits. Once he's taken part in winning that civil war, he uncovers news that a sinister chap has taken possession of an artifact in a mine, and Indy then liberates that as easily as he did those peasants in Mexico. The final 2/3 of the game put Jones in Europe, and indeed in combat fatigues, as he enlists himself in the battle against the Jerrys in World War I. Battling on the front lines and taking down a Big Bertha long-range artillery gun that has been causing issues from a mountaintop are just the first part of his journey. Jones then copies what he does in the MegaDrive game and battles his way to Germany, having a violent train ride there and then taking to the skies in an air battle with the Red Baron. Ooh, different game styles. From there, he has to take out a villainous German commander and his weapon facility, and then get home so Sean Connery can berate him for leaving Wanker's crisp tissues all over his bedroom floor from looking at sexy Renaissance paintings. Big history nerd that he is. The game is a bit of, and I'm quoting Metal Jesus here, a hidden gem. It plays like a cross between Contra and Castlevania, but with a more trial and error approach to proceedings. You won't be finishing the game the first time you play it, unless you're a safe scumming emulating turd like me. The game has a steep learning curve and tricky spots in each level that will leave you laying on the ground counting your teeth the first time you get to them, but once you've got to them again, you'll have no problem, as the controls are pretty crisp, and that's a perfectly acceptable level of game design challenge to me. It's occasionally frustrating, but in a good way, rather than the spiteful frustration of Instruments of Chaos and its completely broken structure. Except for the Big Bertha bit in this, that bit made me cuss bad. It is a short game, but it is a good challenge. There are one-hit deaths, but only if you're not in possession of an item or a weapon like Indiana's hat, a torch, knives, whips, his motorbike or guns. Each time the yet-to-be Dr. Jones gets hit, he will lose that item, so you'll be keen to break into another crate and collect a weapon with which to fight the Germans with. Overall, it's a solid platform adventure that's undeniably NES in its design. Graphically, it's nice, with bookending Ninja Gaiden-style cutscenes, crisp late-era Nintendo graphics, and handsome backgrounds. It's got a decent amount of variety to proceedings and remains addictive throughout. Not a great game, but a very, very good, in fact a surprisingly good one. Nintendo Power, though, they didn't really like it when they reviewed it in January 1993. While they praised the action, they thought the controls and graphics were mediocre and didn't do the show justice. Trust me, lads, play the MegaDrive one and get back to me on that. So then, that's the pair of young Indiana Jones games. What have we got next? Well, as we're speaking of young people, let's look at something designed for the very young. Shall I subject myself to the abject horror that is undoubtedly going to be the PlayStation 1 Teletubbies game? Yes, I will. Good God. Like, subscribe, and K thanks, bye.